Thank the Chow Center, especially Tani and Ratish, and Megan, of course, who put up with my very spotty email behavior. Thank you, guys. uh, my paper will yank you back about 100 years from Christian's, the one that we heard just before this. And as I started writing this paper, or rather as the paper unfolded as I was writing it, I realized that I was I don't know, by design or by some unconscious drive, tending towards the archival end of the ephemera archive double bind that we've talked about. And that is where I'll begin. And I'll make certain general statements from the disciplinary location of history and my position within that field as a music historian. For the discipline of history, a discipline organically linked to the elaboration of modernity and its most resilient political legacy, the nation-state, the archives that is when it's left unmarked and preceded by a definite article, the archives, that is the state's archives, the national archives, is hallowed grounds. It is purportedly the site where collective memory of the body politic is externalized in documentary form and categorically ordered, such that the story of national becoming is never forgotten. With the graphic trace as its quintessential expression, in the form of written and printed documents, the archive does not merely serve a historical or historicizing function. As a physical site, it stands as a monument of the secular modern state, not unlike its big dams and steel towns. Archival documents enjoy legal indemnity as public property. Their access is regulated by Public Records Acts passed in the legislature. Defilement and pilferage constitute criminal offense against the state and its citizens, punishable in different degrees of severity. Given all this, in the era of the nation-state, its archives exert a centripetal force on someone training to be a historian. It is often the first place where the practical aspect of the historian's craft is operationalized and primary research commences. It is where the to-be historian enters with a mental map of an incipient project and confronts and learns how to navigate the state's labyrinthine classificatory logic, such that this dense repository of quote-unquote unprocessed historical records, this phrase is Hayden White's, yields relevant sources. And the truth value imputed to such sources often supersedes that of other documents that do not have the power and agency of the state structurally encoded within. This in spite of the fact that for countries like India, born out of 20th century anti-colonial liberation struggles, much of their archival documents accessible to the researching historian are scripted and arranged by the erstwhile colonizers. From the taxonomy to the building, the archives, the state archives, the national archives, is a colonial inheritance in toto by the new nation state. There is then an already reified mystique to the archives that has its basis in the idea of the sovereign state as the paramount moral authority, the embodiment of the rule of reason. However, for a historian of music in colonial India, the encounter with the state archives, whose fetishized thrall she too cannot escape in the first instance, is largely a demystifying experience. Notwithstanding the seductive exhilaration of mining archival records, it soon becomes apparent that music has at best been a peripheral concern for the state. The graphic trace of matters musical is rather a faint one at the archives. What the music historian learns through the sobering encounter, which is significant in and of itself, is that the modern Indian state, be that in its colonial guise or its post-colonial one, except for certain exceptional instances when it has been reluctantly drawn into intervening in the musical domain, has remained adamant throughout that musical issues are outside its purview and needed to be addressed in civil society. Hence, with the state archives turning out to be mostly fallow, the historian of music in India is forced to look elsewhere, at other documentary repositories, which by default locates her in the terrain of social history. As we know, since around the mid-20th century, various schools of social history in methodological and theoretical conversation with other disciplines like literature and anthropology has mounted a serious challenge on the unrivaled primacy accorded to the state archives in historical research. By reading the archives against the grain through different critical hermeneutic frameworks, by focusing on other forms of subjectivity, temporality, and collectivity that are often marginal to the historical calculus of the modern nation state, hence put under erasure in its records, the social historians have redefined the very nature and scope of the archive itself. Understood in its most basic sense, this redefinition has come to mean that rather than being always already present, for the social historian, an archive has to be actively constructed across different sites, across different documentary repositories. In the specific case of India, the archive of social history has come to be culled from the astounding volume and variety of print matter that began proliferating in society from around the mid-19th century onwards with the progressive socialization of print technology, both in English, but especially through the vernacular presses. And of course, ephemera, for example, independent and autonomous ones such as almanacs and calendars, or engrafted ones such as advertisements and classifieds in newspapers and magazines, constituted a significant part of the print production and circulation. Not surprisingly, social histories of music in India that have emerged in the last decade or so have relied heavily on this material and used it to make certain critical arguments. But one thing I should mention here, even when they are accessing what we are today at this conference calling ephemera, they talk about it in the sense of an archive. So the vocabulary, the optic is that of an archive and not of an ephemera as a category which is theorized and thought out in a historical philosophical sense. And as I was trying to write this paper, preparing to write this paper, I was looking at subaltern studies, which was central in opening up the sense of the archive. And the word ephemera doesn't occur for about the first 10 volumes, so which, made me realize the significance of this conference that you've put together, is that, they've really done good work with what is otherwise ephemeral or what we consider to be ephemera, but not thought of or seen through that optic. There is a popular perception in India that even though 200 years of colonial rule impinged upon nearly every facet of society, culture, and economy in the subcontinent, music somehow remained untouched by it. Indeed, Indian music, a category that unless further qualified as folk, usually signifies the two great classical musical traditions of the subcontinent, Hindustani and Carnatic, is often cited as an example par excellence of cultural resilience in the face of an alien rule, a living connection between the modern Indian nation state as a cultural entity and an ancient glorious civilizational past of which it is supposedly a natural historical outcome. Recent musico-historical scholarship, however, has persuasively challenged this notion and the ideology on which it subsists. Influenced by critical historiographical and theoretical interventions pioneered in India by subaltern studies and from the earlier period Marxian social histories, scholars like Janaki Bakle, Lakshmi Subramaniam have stressed the modernity of Indian musical traditions. They have shown how, during the late 19th, 20th century, Carnatic and Hindustani musics came to be discursively produced as classical via eminently modern means, such as new institutional spaces of performance, creation of associational bodies and a national musical public, devising a notation system for the music, incorporating it within the discursive folds of history, and so on. Still others like Jerry Farrell and David Leleveld have explored the constitutive impact of technologies of music reproduction, such as the gramophone and tapes, and mediation, such as radio and film, on the social experience of music in India. In my own work on the harmonium, I've inquired into how this aerophonic keyboard instrument, invented in Paris in the 1840s and marketed as a cheaper substitute to pianofortes, mutated into the box harmonium in India by the 1880s to ultimately become by far the most popular instrument accompanying everyday musical practice in the subcontinent, cutting across social classes and castes. Thus, addressing the identifiably modern refiguration of India's musical traditions during colonialism and the contradictions entailed in this dialectic, the main thrust of the aforementioned scholarship has been to critique the notion of sui generis authenticity and cultural nationalist exceptionalism that continue to permeate mainstream music discourse in post-colonial India. There is, however, another constitutive aspect of India's musical modernity, Western music, that is generally overlooked in the extant scholarship, owing perhaps to the reason that it opens up a potentially intractable parallax between the category Indian music and musics in India. Indeed, Western music in India presents a kink in narrating the nation in musical terms, as it destabilizes the national musical identity of the citizen subject that is discursively conceived along two interweaving axes of the classical and the folk. Grafted onto the subcontinental musicscape at the very onset of colonialism, Western music has had a vital but spectral presence therein since. Being the music of the ruling race, it was an instrument of considerable social power and prestige that permeated the cultural aspirations of the Indian elite. At the same time, later on, it was also an index of Anglicization and Westernization that came to be viewed with suspicion as compromising cultural authenticity during the nationalist movement. This bind persists in some ways in the contemporary context as well, even if in lesser intensity and in a more diffuse fashion. It remains that on the one hand, Western music motivates power at the very top of the social hierarchy, and on the other hand, it has little or no capacity to represent itself in and through the categorical logic and the discursive framework of imagining and articulating Indian music nationally. The spectrality of Western music in India obtains, in my view, from this contradiction. Indeed, it is intriguing how thin the documentary trail on Western music in India is. Expectedly so in the archive. I mean, State Archive, as I've talked about, you don't get to, you don't come across too many documents which bear the imprint of something musical or musical event or musical occasion, unless and until it's supremely exceptional. Like, there was a movement to declare "God Save the Queen" the national anthem of India in the 1880s. So, and this was done by a vanguard Bengali elite who wanted, who was a totally comprador elite, typical of the class, who wanted to curry favors from the colonial state, and he led this movement to install "God Save the Queen." But there, probably this is not a nice thing to say, the colonial state showed sense and said, you cannot really have a song which is sung in 4-part harmony, grafted on a culture which really has, whose defining essential feature is melody, So, and this movement lasted for about 3 or 4 years, and then it petered out. So yeah, expectedly so, in the state archives, the trail of musical documents, be that Western music or Indian music, is rather thin. But it is also so vis-a-vis Western music in the transcripts of social life as well. A question arises out of this contradiction. How ought a contemporary historian conceptually and historiographically approach the social life of Western music in India? Provisionally drawing upon Deleuze, and I'm just about processing this right now, I find it enabling to think of Western music as a minor music in the Indian context, in the sense that it fundamentally disturbs the regime of identity and the categorical certainty in and of Indian music discourse, not just in the brazenly cultural nationalist kind, but even that of the critical social histories which I've referenced earlier. It is this line of thinking that has contributed to the title of my presentation, Cultural Histories in Minor Key. It is for writing such histories of minor musics that music ephemera becomes critical. This finally brings me to the material that I would like to present before you today. It is a scrapbook of newspaper clippings, concert program cards, and a couple of photographs, this being one of them, put together by the subject of the clippings herself, a remarkable Bengali woman trained as a mezzo-contralto vocalist, specializing in German lieder, named Bina Addy. Addy, by her own witness, was the first Indian woman to take up a professional career in Western music. I chanced upon this fascinating scrapbook, an artifact of bearing the intimate traces of its crafter, in the very early days of my doctoral research, when my intention was to study the jazz and rock music scene in the city of Calcutta from the interwar years until the present day. I had been put in touch by a family friend with someone who worked at the All India Radio, where I wanted to look at its youth-targeted musical programming over time. It was in the course of my conversation with her about my research that Bina Addy's name and the existence of this scrapbook came up. The person I had been put in touch with was Addy's niece, Miss Ratna Sen, and she very graciously gave this amazing scrapbook to me and said that I could keep it for as long as I needed to. This meeting with Miss Sen and its unintended windfall perhaps speaks of the notion of ephemera as an accidental archive. Arresting as Addy's text was to me then, other accidents at various libraries in and around Calcutta and other kind of non-state archives ultimately took my work in a very different direction from the project that I had initially conceived. And Bina Addy's scrapbook found a new resting place in my cupboard from Mrs. Sen's, until the ephemera conference again brought it to life and brought it outside the cupboard. To return to the scrapbook itself, through cards and the clippings, though the cards and the clippings are taken from an 8-year period of intense activity in the singer's life between 1929 and 1937, the scrapbook primarily comprises material from the last 1 year of the span, from May 2nd to be precise, May 2nd, 1936 to May 6th, 1937, when she set sail from Calcutta on a concert tour to the geographical edges of the British Empire, approaching its evanescence, to New Zealand and Australia. So I'll just I haven't really, as I said, I confessed, I got this scrapbook out of the cupboard. I got the scrapbook out of the cupboard precisely for the occasion of this conference, and I haven't really processed all the stuff that is in there, and probably that is true of the nature of ephemera itself, that I haven't processed it. So I'll just let it run through, because it is an overload which I want you to see and feel how much she was interested in archiving herself. And that I found extremely interesting. I don't know when exactly she did that. Her niece wasn't able to tell me when the scrapbook actually materialized. But I think somebody added a column in one of the pages which has her date of expiry, which she died on 2nd February 1962. So it must have been done between, she came back from Australia in 1937. So between 1937 and I'm assuming, in a 10, 15-year period after that. So I'll just so these are the program cards. Probably a little bit of biographical detail is in order here. She left India in 1928 and she went to England first, then to Germany, then to Italy, came back to England, learning with different masters. So while she was in Germany, she learned the lieder from Elena Gerhardt, who was apparently a very famous lieder singer at that point. In England, she learned from Frederick King, who was associated with the Royal Academy of Music, who had just retired from the Royal Academy of Music at that point after serving for some 40 years or so. And I don't exactly know who the figure was in Italy. But it seems like within 2 years of her departure from India, and the previous program sheet we saw was from 1929, she was already giving public performances in London. So here we also get a sense of the range of material she was presenting. And if you look at number 5 over here, she is doing a set of 4 Bengali songs, 2 of them by Rabindranath Tagore, the Nobel laureate, who features rather frequently in how she represents herself to journalists, and that's there in the other clippings that you'll soon see. One is a Vaishnav Kirtan, it's a devotional song form, which was taken up by Tagore and worked on, Shundari Radhe. And the last one, Bharat Amar, is a early nationalist song by D.L. Roy, who was I think in an antagonistic relationship with Tagore, right? Mm-hmm. So this is after she's come back to Calcutta in 1933. And this is the program card from the concert that she presents in front of a number of state luminaries. And here she knows that she's presenting in front of an audience which is probably not as clued in, so she gives detailed explanation of each song. So this is the first newspaper clipping after she lands in Australia on her way to New Zealand. And I'll just pause here once more. You'll see most of the photographs, it's usually a low angle shot where she's looking into the lens. It makes her look larger than life that she is. And I don't know if you can read the clippings, but one feature that is commented upon in almost every clipping that is there is her silent and the way she carries it. So this is, she presents this interesting figure to the wide gaze. On the one hand, she's terribly exotic. She's presenting herself in sari, and So, which they're commenting upon. On the other hand, she's also extremely familiar, because she's participating in an art form, which is basically Western high art. I mean, high music and high art music, and that is extremely familiar to the crowd that she's presenting. So, she's the strange bind of the exotic familiar that comes into view. And in most of the interviews that she gives to journalists, she's also talking about how women's education is improving in India, how with Gandhi and Tagore there's a new liberation, emancipation of women that is happening, but for large swaths of the society, women are, I mean, the people are so poor that they cannot afford the education. So there is a progressivist, developmentalist, national developmentalist logic that she's a cultural and national representative in this case, clearly. So lots of women's magazine. She appears on YWCA fora, and all of these conflicts are rather new to me. I haven't really, it's not a part of my work, and I'm really getting to know it right now as I'm encountering the scrapbook. So these are the advertisements for, are these the tea room ones? No. Departmental stores and tea rooms. So H.J. Smith, Hayes, these two seem to have been very heavy patrons so far. And here are the paratextual masks that she has, to draw your attention to where she appears in the information space. This is when she's in New Zealand now, so you have Maori statues. So it's an incredibly dense scrapbook, and it seems like she must have kept a very good tab on whichever newspaper or magazine she was appearing in. And so here she's talking about her relationship with Tagore. Okay. About time too. So by the way of a conclusion or a provisional conclusion, the scrapbook format itself presents interesting questions regarding where it belongs in the continuum of the archive and the ephemera. It is an outcome of an archival impulse, an intentional impulse to archive the self. Addy's scrapbook is chronologically organized. There are paratextual markings on some clippings, and so on. Yet the contents of the scrapbook is almost a run-through list of classic music ephemera that in the last decade have been put to greatly rewarding use by concert historians of Europe and America. A typical list of such ephemera, drawn up by concert historian Christina Bashford, comprise, quote, concert programs, handbills, posters, tickets, newspaper advertisements and reviews, administrative records, contracts with performers, and so on. In other words, documentation, in short, documentation that was associated with the business of putting live music before audiences, end quote. From the ephemera in Addy's scrapbook, it becomes possible not only to piece together her biography up to that point, it also opens up doors to other channels of inquiry that I'm completely new to, at this stage at least. International women's solidarity movements, their ideological field, the European music that was Addy's speciality, and so on and so forth. But as Moinag Bishash suggested in yesterday's opening panel, it is ultimately the normalization into coherent narratives and narrative coherence. It's disciplining into ideologized historiographies. That is what makes an archive out of an ephemera. For today, I will let Bina Addy's scrapbook wander in the liberating in-between space that it signifies for itself.